Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Transection podcast for episode 3, where we are interviewing Cle'Tse Searle-Seaton. Cle'Tse is an activist online. She and I have been in contact for some years, and actually, interestingly, we talked about doing a podcast or something, some kind of interview or video collab or something like that for ages and ages, long before I even had this podcast. So I was so excited to finally get to do it. Cle'Tse has the page on Facebook called Not This Black Woman. I think she's also on Twitter and Instagram as well, and she also has a Facebook group which I think is intersectionality with Not This Black Woman. I'll put links on the website for those who are interested. And Cle'Tse talks a lot about how to be authentic as a black woman, especially if you don't conform to traditional norms and things like that. And I love Cle'Tse's work. She's also training to be, and is about to qualify, I believe, as a therapist or counsellor, one or the other. I don't know what the difference is in America. But yeah, she's really up to date with like mental health things, as you might imagine, and she is also, like me, self-taught in the world of activism and intersectionality. I mean, obviously we've learned a lot off of other people, but she and I have had quite a symbiotic kind of relationship online, where I've taught her lots about trans and non-binary things, and she's taught me lots about Black Lives Matter. She talks about some really amazing things in this interview. I really love the way that she delivers the information, and she's so upfront and transparent about what a process this has been for her. And I think that is a really important thing to model as an activist, is empathy, obviously not without being a doormat, but empathy and being with people in their process, wherever they are, in learning about these things, and, you know, talking about really being with people and allowing space for people to grow and to learn, and trying to not make that too difficult. So I'm really excited to bring you this interview. She's an absolute diamond, and I'm so excited that you all get to listen to her as well, because she's really got some amazing insights and so much wisdom. Obviously I'm fan personing here. I'm a massive fan of Cle'Tse and her work. So enjoy it, and if you haven't already signed up to our mailing list, I'm going to tell you again. It's at mooksharrishill.com/transection. There's a green box. You put your name and your email in there. It takes 2 seconds, and that way, whenever we're doing something, or we've got something to tell you about, or we're releasing an episode, then you'll get an email. We only really send one out a week, and I tend to do that as an episode release and a little bit of a newsletter. So it's pretty simple. I don't like to spam people, but it's there, and there's important stuff in there. And also, for those of you who haven't seen yet, I have a free resource on my website, which is called Trans Plus Gender Identity, a Guide for Beginners. You can get a free copy at mooksharrishill.com/PDF. It's a 10-page booklet, so it's perfect for people who are just starting out on their understanding of trans things. And it doesn't matter whether you're using it to learn to support your child, or you're learning it as a professional person. Maybe you're a therapist, and you want to be able to support a diverse range of clients. Also, if you're a doctor or anyone in the medical profession and perhaps you haven't had much training on it, it's a really, really good place to start. I've condensed my many years, like 6.5 years of like daily reading and study into this, and the collection of all of that information into a simple framework that's on there. It's 10 pages. The first page is my face, so it's not too much reading. And on that same web page, if you scroll down, there's also an hour's masterclass that's totally free, and you can just literally watch it and follow along with what I'm explaining. And all the sort of stories and things that go with that. So I really bring it to life. All of the reviews I've had so far have been really, really good. So I'm really aiming to help people with that resource, and I intend for that to be free forever and for people to use it in any situation they need, work, home, school, anything like that. And because I believe in us, whether you're an ally or yourself trans, non-binary, whatever. I think I all think we're capable of coming together in lots of different ways, and I think this is my contribution anyway, and I want to make sure that help is there for anyone who needs it, who's got an internet connection, basically, because not everyone can afford, to go to coaches and specialists and all the rest of it, and I want to make sure that people have a fighting chance, because the reality is that for a lot of us, life can be really difficult, and not even because people mean for it to be, but just because that's the way things are set up at the moment. And yeah, I think with a bit of team effort, we could really, things are changing, and I think they could change even more, and it would be even more better and exciting. So that's there. It's at muxharrishill.com/PDF. You get your own free copy. You can send it to people. I don't mind, so long as it's being used to help people. Then that's the aim of the game, isn't it? You can also follow us on social media if you're into social media. We're on Facebook, the Transection Podcast, Instagram at Transection Podcast, and Twitter at TransectionP. I also have we have a TikTok, which I think is Transection Podcast as well. But mostly I just do that to announce releases. I haven't recorded anything else on there. I'm probably a bit past it and too scared as a 30-something-year-old to get into TikTok. But yeah. Anyway, it's all there. You know the drill. Enjoy this interview. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Transection Podcast. I'm Harris and I'm joined today by Cle'Tse Searle, who is founder of the Facebook page Not This Black Woman. Hi, Cle'Tse.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good. Do you realise that it's been about a year since we talked about doing a podcast of some kind?
Really?
Yeah.
I had not realized it'd been that long.
I know, it's mad, isn't it? Because I remember I was messaging you when I was sat in a cafe in Perth in Western Australia.
Yes.
Messaging you then, and I was like, I don't know how this is going to happen, but it's going to happen. And now it's like, yeah, it's October. Yeah, so it's a year ago since I left Australia, which is mental. So finally, this is happening, and I'm very pleased because I follow you on Facebook and everything that you do. I really love how fierce and passionate you are about rights, and particularly talking about things that are difficult for the Black community. And you're based in, whereabouts in the US are you?
I'm in Texas.
Texas. How is that?
You know, it's hard to be, I wouldn't say liberal or progressive and forward thinking in a southern state, Republican state. But it's beautiful here.
Yeah. Good. It's good that you've got some really good bit, because I mean, I can't imagine. I've got a friend, Tiffany, who's Black, and she's in Alabama. And she came over here to train for NLP with me. Well, she didn't specifically come for me, but we ended up training on the same course together. And I said to her, like, what's it like being in England for a week and spending time like just seeing sort of like regular normal people and stuff? And she was like, it's so different, because back home I'm used to like racism being in my face constantly. I said, would you move here? She said, no, your weather's too shit. So exactly. Yeah. Um, so one thing I did want to ask you, Cachet, is why did you go with Not This Black Woman as your Facebook page? What values are in there for you?
Yeah, the name itself came from the fact that I don't subscribe to a lot of the stereotypes that happens when you're Black. And I think that often people think we're a monolith and we are grouped together. And so I really wanted to empower other Black women to be their authentic self and to not be confined to what society says we are or should be. So that is kind of how the name derived itself. And since then, I've kind of allowed the people who follow me to navigate it and to direct it a little bit more. And I've learned a lot about different marginalized groups, and I try to make sure that I advocate for them as well. And learning that just being in Texas itself, you're very sheltered from, let's say, the trans community, the non-binary community, and the LGBTQ community. You're very sheltered from the disabled community as well. So just learning more about how to advocate for other groups is really important to me as well.
Mm. Yeah, I can understand that. I think as well, for me being in the UK, we get so much of the news about the US over here, but we don't. But, you know, obviously that's all stuff that I'm seeing on the news or my friends are telling me, and I do think sometimes that we can judge ourselves a bit for living in a bubble. But I mean, you can't live everywhere, right?
Right, that's true.
So yeah. Um, so you've mentioned before that there are a lot of taboos for Black women, particularly. Um, First of all, why do you think that is? Why do you think that there are such kind of narrow margins for error, supposedly for Black women?
You know, I really think it goes back to slavery in America. There were only a couple different aspects of Black women that people saw, and that is the one who maybe lived in the house, who took care of the children and was the maid, or the Jezebel type, who was very sexual, over sexualized, things of that nature. And I think those became ingrained in what it's like to be a Black woman. And instead of humanizing us, we were characterized, if that makes sense, a caricature. Can we edit that part?
Yes. I personally enjoyed it, but we'll chop it out if you want.
Yeah, a caricature of what we are. And I think that is bled over to a lot of what's going on in today's society. And we're trying to shed that, but it's a very slow process.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. So one of the things you've mentioned before is difficult for you, and I think for your community, as you described it, is mental health and discussing mental health. So how's that been for you?
Well, I have bipolar, and I was diagnosed at 21. And I remember my aunt telling me, don't ever say that in public. And she's like a distant aunt, but she said, your kids will be taken away from you. You're not going to be able to have a job. So there's this very big fear in the African American community surrounding mental health. And so it's not only looked at as a taboo, but it's very shameful. And it's across the board, be depression, anxiety, bipolar. So it's something that I've kind of grew up with not sharing. We don't like to air our dirty laundry, period, not even with each other. It's kind of whatever happens, you deal with it on your own and you stay strong and you move forward. So I think kind of is rooted in that.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess like although some of that is quite negative, I think I can appreciate that actually someone really loving can be encouraging you to be quiet, right? Because they have some very real and sometimes justified fears about,
Mm-hmm.
you know, being mistreated and somebody being more harsh on you than they would like a white counterpart who had the same issue.
Absolutely. And I think as Black women specifically, we have learned to be strong and to push forward. And so we don't have the same luxury as, say, our white women counterparts who, when they are feeling emotions or they are going through a mental health crisis, they're coddled somewhat, if that makes sense. They are pitied. They are empathized with, whereas with the Black people, it's seen it as a more of a negative thing, as maybe attention seeking, if that makes sense, as opposed to having that same compassion extended. We don't get that.
Mm. And for you, is that within your personal community generally, or is it, do you
I
get?
would say that it's the broader society, but
Mm.
because of how society treats us, I believe our community has learned to adapt, and that means stuffing and not talking about some of those issues that are really important to get out and to go to therapy for.
Mm. Yeah. So do you, whenever you're sort of dealing with these things, do you ever kind of look at these situations and like see that racism within those situations? Like I mean, apart from the fact that you're treated differently, um like for example, I heard a lot I've got friends sort of in the medical field, and they were discussing at one point how um you know, even the area that you grew up in, and particularly like in England, if you've got people who've grown up in Africa and then moved over here, you know, they're going to have a very different
Mm,
possible reaction and how they express themselves compared to, you know, somebody like me, where we might be a bit more controlled. And you know, again, the really funny like white stereotype of being uptight with
mm.
a pole up your ass comes to mind.
Sure.
um, but yeah, do you think that, do you see some of that, um, because I mean, you know, you I think you've got like African American vernacular English and things like that. Like the way you express yourself potentially could be quite different to like how a white person's going to do it. And like I see sometimes and have heard that people's reactions have been kind of pathologized rather than just seen as kind of like just a different way of expressing yourself or dealing
Sure.
with your feelings.
Sure. Absolutely. When it comes to, there's this, we call it code switching, and how we speak to those in our community versus how we speak to the outer society. And I think that some of that comes with just not being accepted and being looked at as uneducated, as unsophisticated, and that mostly comes from just a assumption based on how we look and the fact that we are Black. So we've developed this adaptation to be able to code switch and to really use that to our advantage, if that makes sense.
Mm. Yeah, I get that a lot. It's not the same thing at all, but I often found it difficult, like growing up. I'm on the spectrum. I didn't know that growing up, and I just never understood why people didn't understand what I was trying to communicate to them. And particularly when
Mm,
I was going to the doctors, I would have to, I taught myself to basically like research whatever problem I thought that I had, look at all of the symptoms and sort of memorize those, and then I would go into the doctors, and then I would be able to like mask and, you know, pretend to be neurotypical, and would have this conversation like, oh, I'm experiencing this and this and this. So
sure.
I was, you know, and then I would help the doctor to reach the point where they understood what I was getting at. And so I would basically often be like diagnosing myself,
Sure.
you know, because I didn't have that support, and and I wasn't very well understood, and I was always thought of as like a bit quirky, and or sometimes like my behavior was like inconvenient. And
Mm,
uh, so yeah, like it, I do find it amazing that like a lot of these systems are very kind of very, like they've got this very one like singular language of how to discuss things. And I saw a meme a little while ago. I think it was a black doctor on Twitter, and he was saying like there needs to be more black doctors because code switching whilst you're sick, you know, your circumstances are very different, but potentially.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you need a black doctor to talk that through with, who understands you and like where you're from and maybe your specific situation and all that kind of thing. So what do you
Absolutely.
think? Yeah. And that brings me on to, so you've nearly finished your degree. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Well, I'm excited to be done. It took a little bit longer than expected, but I have a degree and I will have a degree in clinical mental health counseling in December, and I'm really excited about that. There's not a lot of Black women in the field, actually. So that's really difficult because a lot of our younger generation is coming up with different mental health disorders, and they don't have a role model to look up to or someone that looks like them to be able to actually help them through some of those issues. And that's extremely important, especially for young men, because going in for help for a mental disorder is hard enough, and then being a man and then being Black on top of that is really difficult. So it's something that I really wanted to do and I've been encouraged to do, and something that I'm really passionate about.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well done for all your hard work. How how has it been for you being, you know, sometimes in need of support for your own mental health, in looking for support from?
That's a great question. um, it's been difficult. I've had mental health um, issues since I was 12 and my grandmother died. So back then, that was a choice that my parents made for me, like where to go or who to see. But since being an adult, I've only seen one Black woman counselor. And it's kind of a field that's saturated. So that's kind of a disheartening thing to know, that there's only one that I've actually seen and connected with. But it's difficult because having a mental health condition and being in the mental health field, there's a lot of stigma there. And so I can't really talk about it with peers or colleagues like you can a physical illness, if that makes sense. But then also being able to find a counselor that can relate to what I'm going through has been a huge challenge.
Mm, I can imagine. Well, hopefully people will see what you're doing and be like, oh, I can do that. I've always
Yeah.
wanted to do that, and now I've seen Cle'Tse do it. I can do it, maybe myself.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh,
Mm-hmm.
you're a role model.
I'm trying.
I think that's all you can do, right? You'll never get it 100%
Absolutely.
right. As you know from running a Facebook page, there's always someone who's like, "Oh, this is rubbish. Why did you say that?"
Why do you say that? Exactly.
Because I bloody want to.
100%.
Yeah. So uh, you mentioned also about how well educated Black women are in the US. Tell me a bit more about that. I wasn't aware of that before.
Yes, it's something that I learned a little bit ago, and Black women are actually the most educated class in America. And I was really shocked by that, but they're getting more degrees, more advanced degrees. And the study was talking about how come there's still so many Black women in poverty. And so a lot of that comes from being single parent families. So even though you're getting more degrees, there's still more single parent families. And also degrees that are sought after, even when they're advanced degrees, they get paid less money than their than white women, and significantly less money than white men. So it's the system itself is made very against Black women.
Yeah. So how do you feel about this idea of like forced diversity when companies or laws bring in the like a quota of positions that they have to fill with like not men or not white people or something? Because I think it performs a function to a certain extent. Like how else do you encourage people to change when they don't have to, otherwise they can choose not
Mm-hmm.
to?
As far as affirmative action is what we call in America.
Yeah.
I feel like it's a necessary evil, if that makes sense. And I hesitate to say that, but I'll explain why. Unfortunately, we live in a society in America that is extremely racist. Slavery was not that long ago, so it's very ingrained in who this country is as a whole. And so, in order to combat some of that, they had to put certain considerations in place. And so, sometimes people wouldn't even be considered if they were Black for positions that they were well qualified for. Sometimes people think that there is an underqualified Black who's getting a job that a otherwise qualified white is not getting, but that's not exactly the truth. Even when it comes to colleges, they both are qualified. It's just ensuring that they are diverse, if you said. Now, it kind of on the back end creates a problem because people who got passed over, they think, then have hostility towards the, those who actually got the position. So that's why I say it's a necessary evil.
Right. Yeah, that's a tricky one, but also, I don't know. I'm just seeing that meme in my head of like boohoo white feelings.
Absolutely.
Like,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's that thing, isn't it? It's like, I'm entitled to that job. I should have got that job. And now somebody, a different color to me, has got it. So therefore, it must be a mistake. I'm like,
and,
get
and
over
I
yourself.
and I deserve that job. It's like not, like you said, it's just the entitlement.
Yes.
I believe the hard part about it in the line that's drawn is that it almost creates more racism because they're not thinking about maybe there's 10% of your workforce must be non-white. They're not considering how little that is and compared to the population as a whole. But like you said, yeah, of course, you have everything else. It's okay. Let's have that little piece of the pie and it's going to be okay.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not saying that to somebody who's struggling to support their family, or like not taking the piss out of people in poverty or anything like that. But sometimes it's like, I saw something the other day that were like, oh, if we, it was anti Black Lives Matter, and it was something like, oh, well, like Black people are going to take over, they're going to be in charge, blah blah blah. And I just commented, surely it's their fucking turn by now.
Yes.
Go for it, like fucking go for it. I think it's good. I'm like,
I think it's no, go ahead.
I think society is fucking so lucky that all the Black community are asking for is equality, because they could rightfully, in my opinion, be asking for so much more than that. Reparations, as just a start, and that would completely dismantle all of our systems of power, because by the time you've paid reparations and what that's worth, that is in both the UK and the US, as explained by Kahindi Andrews to me. We have accumulated wealth purely because of slavery. By the time that you pay those reparations, you've got nothing left. Like that's how much we've benefited as powerful countries, and that's how it's happened in the first place. So when people are complaining like, oh, then we've got to think about 10% of our workforce not being white, I'm like, that's nothing. That's such
exactly
yeah. Anyway, sorry, I went on a little bit of a rant.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. It's the society we live in today that we're trying to change. And it's interesting with the protest how we're asking for change and it seemed volatile or violent. And like you said, equality is something that we all deserve. It's not something that we should be having to petition for. And yet we still are having to do that.
Yeah. I think for a lot of people that I've seen who've spoken out about equality in general, I think they don't have any idea that there's anything wrong in the first place. And even when you're like, oh, well, I tried to argue with a racist recently. I gave up after not very long. I didn't have much stamina that day. But
Yes.
he was saying, he was like, oh, look, if you look at the number of white men shot in America by police, it's still more than however many or whatever. But then, but I was saying, but look at why they, in what situations they were shot. Again, the white men are really dangerous. My upbringing taught, well, statistically speaking, my upbringing taught me that more about white men more than anyone else. Um, and I don't really, I think you've got to be really in denial and unwilling to go to a place of empathy to continue to deny that there's an issue.
Sure.
Or just be living under a rock or in a swamp like Shrek. Although I'm pretty sure Shrek would be all for BLM personally.
Yes, yes. I think something you said made me think of this, and I'm not sure where it came from, so any credit, please take this to whoever made it. But they were saying essentially that if you don't think racism exists, would you want to live as a Black person? Would you choose willingly to live as a Black person? And I think that oftentimes, especially racists would say no, but even the typical white American would say no, and they have to really examine why is that.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Very, very.
Yeah. I like those questions that make you think and you go, actually that's not an easy answer, and you're like, yeah, that's the thing. Yeah. So talking more about taboos, so just for those who haven't met you before, just tell us a little bit about like your family life, or sort of how you're spending your week, and what life looks like for you and who you're sharing that with.
Sure. Well, I actually have two partners, and they are both amazing. I have two children who are autistic, and that's been a phenomenal experience, honestly, to see how their minds work and to see how much I've grown as a mom and as a person being their mother. My weeks are spent at my internship. I feel like I live there, but my partner's very active in how we parent our children. So right now I'm focusing a lot on my degree, but I hope that as time goes on, I can spend more time at home. I was a stay-at-home mom for about 5 years, and I thoroughly enjoy raising children. So it's definitely
Good.
something I want to get back to.
Yeah, that's nice. That's nice. So you've mentioned before that it's a taboo subject to talk about polyamory as a Black woman. So seeing as you've got two partners, do you want to tell us a little bit like what that's been like for you, and sort of finding happiness, but also the contrast of it being a little bit taboo as well?
Sure. Well, I'll give you a little bit of background on something, but I met one of my partners about 12 years ago, and we lost touch, and then I found Robert, and we married. We've been together for 7 years. It's been lovely. And we went through a really interesting time in our relationship after the birth of my second kid where we really weren't connecting. And I had mentioned polyamory, and we took like a whole year to talk about this. And well, I wanted to revisit the situation with Mark because I've always loved him, and it just kind of fell into place. But one of the reasons it's taboo, I believe, is that polyamory in America is very much seen as a white elitist thing, you know? And it's a very interesting, it's almost like that, like racism and stereotypes permeate every aspect of, society here. But not to skip ahead, but the Black community is very spiritual, very spiritual. God is a very central point in their lives, and marriage is between two people. So in our society, trying to break those molds and talking about being able to love multiple people and relationship dynamics looking very different, that's something that is seen as a crisis, honestly, and an abomination. So just living authentically has been really difficult for my family to accept overall.
Yeah. How's that felt?
You know, my mom is a huge supporter of me. Like, we're very, very close. And it's been extremely difficult. It's been a difficult road. We're about 2.5 years into this journey for our family. And she's just starting to come around to acknowledge that I have two partners. For a really long time, she only acknowledged one of them, and the one that I was legally married to. So it was hurtful. And the rest of my family don't get it. They have not even tried to understand it. So I've been ostracized in a way from my extended family because it's just not seen as acceptable.
Mm. Yeah, that must be, yeah, pretty difficult. But I often think about a lot of us in being kind of like these breakers of cycles and kind of bringing this new, fresh stuff in and seeing the little explosions that happen sometimes.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
but I think it's difficult, isn't it, when you've got a family who overall are quite close, but yet you just have this little sort of difference. And it's, you know, you hear about the dramatic stories of like people trying to come out about whatever it is about their identity, and then it doesn't go well, so they're like, or they don't think it will go well, so they never try. And then you hear about, you know, people who go for it and either are super accepted or they get kicked out.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't hear a lot about, you know, for the many of us who are on these sort of ongoing journeys with parents and family members, where it can take them years to
Sure.
even get to a point when they can talk to you. And I think, you know, you're not going to throw away every single relationship, like with family or whatever.
Sure.
And for many, there are these sort of years and years worth of work that somebody's doing sort of in their own mind, just to kind of be in your presence and try to accept what you're saying to them. And it's such an odd space, isn't it, especially when like you've got that contrast of like living your truth, and you know, you've got um Robert and Mark, and it's you know, it sounds to me like you've kind of reached a real balance with those partners. And you know, you were smiling a lot when you were talking about them.
Sure.
And yeah, so I can appreciate that that's kind of difficult. Do you do you think as well though that a lot of that attitude is kind of like that very colonial, like white supremacist thing? Like, to your knowledge, is there any kind of um, basis for like polyamorous relationships? Maybe not necessarily in your um, heritage. You know, you might not know what that heritage is specifically, but do you ever kind of look at these other cultures that might have been the cultures of like ancestors, and just be really annoyed at white people again?
You know, it's really interesting because being a woman and having two male partners is taboo in that of itself. But like you said, it's kind of interesting because when I look at white people, they sometimes they feel like they have to own every aspect of society. And so how dare you participate in something that we're making new, if that makes sense, when this is something that's been happening for
Thousands.
who knows how many, you know, thousands of years. So it's very interesting because even coming out of Africa, a lot of the cultures, they wouldn't call it polyamory, but have multiple partners. The men do. So it's not a new thing for our culture, but as we've changed and shifted, yeah, I think that's something that I have to consider, you know?
Mm. Yeah, for sure. I watched this program, I think it was last year, and it was about this reality TV family, a white family from the north of England. They'd had their house with permission of the village um, to they rebuilt their English house on the land of this village in, I want to say it was in Namibia. I might be wrong. Um, and that they were sort of doing this cultural exchange where they were learning about how the other lived and making friends and stuff. And in that culture, you might be married to somebody, but if your husband is away for a long time, like shepherding the sheep and the cattle around, like you might get pregnant in that time by another guy in the village, but technically that child will always belong to your husband, because like it doesn't matter who you have sex with. And it's like they have this very open attitude towards sex and sleeping with people and having babies and stuff. And I mean, obviously that's not everybody's cup of tea, but I can imagine that for some people they would be very happy in those kinds of arrangements. And it does really make me think like how much damage and how much we've lost in terms of like cultural value,
Sure.
because of all that kind of thing. So you touched upon not being spiritual, and you and I have had conversations about that before. Tell us a bit about like what it was like leaving church and why you did it and what happened, or if you
Oh
want
goodness.
to. If you want to.
That's a big topic, but I'll try to keep it concise. I grew up in the church. My mom's actually a pastor, and I had a very deep relationship with God, if that makes sense, and it guided a lot of my choices in my life. When my second child was born, I almost died giving birth to him. And in that year that followed, I really had to decide what was important to me, what I believed, what does spirituality look for me? Am I spiritual? And in that process, I started researching the origin of the Bible. I started researching origins of different other religions, like Buddhism, Hinduism, like Islam, and even looked at the Tao, like just trying to understand where I fit into what my God looked like. And ultimately, in examining the Bible, it just began to fall apart for me, if that makes sense, historically speaking, and the characters in the Bible. And as that happened, my understanding of my own spirituality changed. And for a while, I identified as an atheist. And I would say now I'm a little bit more like a connection to source, or connection to the universe, or, you know, the earth, things of that nature. But leaving the church was traumatic. It was extremely traumatic for me. We were very involved in our church, and it was a very large church, and it was actually very controlling. We didn't realize that until we actually wanted to leave. And it was pretty brutal, if I'm honest. And we lost every friend that we had made in that church because we were no longer believers. My husband grew up in the church as well. And my mother obviously is spiritual, so they didn't really accept the fact that we weren't. And his parents are a little bit more laid back, if that means they're not going to control us or tell us what to do. My mom just kicked it up into high gear. She was trying to pray for us, lay hands on us, like constantly talking about the Bible, and it was overwhelming. We had to actually cut her out of our lives for about 6 months because it was just nonstop bombardment of religiosity. But I think after about 3 years now, we've deconverted. We've kind of got our stride in what that looks like. And my husband's still non-religious, non-spiritual. He's on the spectrum as well, and it's kind of a black and white thing for him. And so, whereas I am just like, I can be spiritual and still not believe in a specific religion. But as far as that having to relate to the Black community, and during slavery times, the African American and the Black spirituals were extremely instrumental in them getting through some of all those tough things that happened to them. That was the religion of their oppressors, but it's something that they made their own. And as time went on, it's something that became very central to their existence. So leaving the faith and being an atheist or being a nonconformist and in any way when it comes to religion is seen as not just a personal decision, but a slap in the face for all that they've done, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, I understand obviously that, you know, when you're going through a tough time, you do form like an emotional attachment to a religion if you feel that it's really like served you and nurtured you, especially if you're having a kind of desert experience. But I mean, I know a lot of people have talked about how the kind of the spread of Christianity was very much part of the colonialism and white supremacy of sort of days gone by,
Sure.
and continues to be used that way, unfortunately, sometimes now. How do you feel about it now you've had these sort of a few years of having space from it? Have you had any of these moments where you've looked back at things that you used to believe that actually maybe like fueled any kind of like internalized racism or shame, or like, you know, is there anything that coming out of that you've felt like better about yourself, or you've connected more deeply with who you are now that there's not a religion in the way?
Sure. I think it's interesting because growing up in the States, even though we don't really consider it, we think of white Jesus. And it's a really sad thing almost because it erases the culture of the people in the Bible and who originally wrote the Bible. And so it's hard to look back and consider the fact that this religion, that Christianity specifically, was used often to oppress, not often, to oppress Black people during slavery. That's what it was designed to do then. And it's hard to know that I was a part of that religion, if that makes sense. So it was something that I had to really dig deep and overcome, and also realize that I'm not going to necessarily change anyone's view in my family on religion because it's so deeply embedded within them.
Yeah.
And being able to reconcile that. For me, leaving Christianity has been one of, if not the most liberating experiences I've ever had. It's allowed me to really make some decisions that were beneficial and that are healthy, whereas before I didn't know how to do that, if that makes sense. I left a very abusive marriage, and I always felt guilty about being remarried. And I think letting go of that hold has been really freeing. So, I mean, overall, I'm just a more centered, happier individual, not having a religion, and also being able to appreciate the dynamics of all religions, because there's some good in every spiritual walk, and being able to just look at that and look at those cultures and being able to appreciate that instead of proselytize has been really nice.
Good. Yeah, it's good to hear you say that. I mean, I won't go into mine because I discussed mine in series one. But yeah, I think when you're part of a religion that so clearly doesn't represent you in any way, or you know, maybe sort of in terms of your identity or where you're from, or and can potentially be rooted in a lot of bigotry as well. I think it's been so freeing for me too to step outside of that, and I think there was always a little bit of shame. I was part of the Church of England growing up, which is quite liberal. It's quite, you know, I never heard much kind of like homophobic rhetoric or anything like that, but at the same time it was never discussed. It was something that was not even a secret, but you just didn't talk about it. So I think unless you're in a place where there's real explicit inclusion and you're really celebrated, I feel it's just possibly damage waiting to happen. And I wonder if you have felt in finding a little bit of, you know, spirituality on your own, if you're able to see like the divine in people more. Because I know that for me, like after leaving the church, I was able to, you know, I wasn't judging people anymore by the religious standards. I really feel like I do experience the, oh, he's still there. Oh,
I'm here. Sorry.
right. Yeah, I really feel now like I do experience and really recognize the divine in other people that I don't think I would have seen if I was still religious.
No, you're absolutely right. I spent so much time worrying about what people were doing in their personal lives and how that fit into the Bible, that I couldn't appreciate them for who they were individually. And it's something beautiful about being able to look at people and just see what makes them happy, what makes them unique, and being able to learn from them. And I know that I couldn't do that before. As you know, I'm sure in the Christian culture, the LGBTQ community is very, very discriminated against. And I remember that was one of the key parts that made me question my Christianity. I have two uncles, and they've been married for about, I say married, but you know, that wasn't legal, but together for about 29 years. And that's the longest of anyone in our family besides our grandparents. And so I remember looking at their love and their respect and consideration for each other and just thinking, that can't be wrong. Like, that just can't. And I think that little seed of doubt helped me to really re-examine what Christianity was for me. So like you said, just being able to look at people who they are, appreciate who they are, and really love them for that has been huge.
Good. How do you feel, you know, like I saw something a little while ago where a girl had been sent home from school in America, I couldn't tell you where, for wearing a t-shirt that had passages from the Bible and was basically speaking out against homosexuality. It was by our standards homophobic, but interestingly there was a guy in the comments section who was obviously, you know, very, very religious Christian guy supposedly, who was saying that, you know, her letting people know that what they were doing was wrong was an act of love because she didn't want them to go to hell. And it was, you know, I mean, obviously we have reactions to people doing things like this and saying things like this, but I do find it fascinating in some ways that people really justify what they're doing, you know, to tell people like your love is wrong, and the way that you love this person is an abomination and all that sort of thing. And I'm telling you that because I love your soul. I'm like, I really can't get into the headspace of where that comes from.
I wish I could give you an answer, because even as a Christian, I never did that, if that makes sense. It was something that I couldn't fathom participating in.
Mm.
And I remember, I'll tell you this story. My husband's father is a elder at a church, at their church they grew up in. And he came over one day and he was going through all the passages about homosexuality and why it's wrong. And it was very interesting because he didn't really know the history of the Bible or even some of the original language that was used.
Mm-hmm.
So, but because of that, he's just been promoting an idea that's always been there, even though he didn't have that language. And so for him, it was just so wrong. And we would ask why. Oh, because the Bible says so. Okay. So it's just this circular thing where it's like, I don't have my own thoughts. I don't have my own opinions. I don't have any experience because I've never met anyone who's gay or lesbian or of the LGBTQ community. So I have absolutely no experience with this community. And I'm taught that what they're doing is wrong, and not just what they're doing, but who they are. Like who they are is wrong. And so it's something that for us, we had to really, I mean, my husband just spoke out against it and was just saying, if your God is really a God of love, as you say he is, then what, shouldn't you be compelled to love them where they are and who they are? And it was something that they really had to think about and consider.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. And how is it now? Because you've mentioned that you're pansexual. High fives, same. I've got my tattoo there. Look, my little.
Oh, I love it.
I don't know if you can see it. It's a bit stretched.
I can see it. I love it.
For those of you who can't see, it's sort of like a watercolor pansexual pride flag, which is pink at the top, yellow in the middle, and blue at the bottom, and then it's got the all genders symbol like in black through it. But yeah, so anyway, getting off topic, how is that for you now, like having sort of come to a point where pansexuality feels like a good label possibly for you, and then still being around all of this kind of religious dogma?
Yeah, it's been challenging because I mean, we don't hide our, like, my husband is just straight white male. Like there's nothing, like, really, he doesn't really have to deal with any of that discrimination, if that makes sense. But because he's my partner, he feels a lot of questions about like my decisions or about my sexuality. And it's been really challenging, especially with our parents initially, because it's very it's not the norm, if that makes sense, to be open about your sexuality and then to have a sexuality that's not straight. So I think the best thing I can do is just keep talking about it, because it's so important to have representation, but it's also not easy because there's so much pushback. So yeah, it's just pushing through.
Yeah, I think that's all you can do sometimes. I do think that a really big part of coming to peace with your own differences, whatever they may be, is to accept, like, this is the way the world is right now. It's probably not going to be very different tomorrow or the day after that, and just really making peace with it. I met a girl recently, I won't say who she is, and I see a lot of that in her, and I've got other friends who, you know, like if they're dealing with disability that they might not have always had, or they've come to realization about who they are, lots of things where you're like, oh God, it's just, this is something that is not going to be necessarily straightforward, and not anytime soon. And yeah, I think, and especially I guess for you as well, like having so many kind of intersecting issues within what should be a celebrated and amazing kind of identity. And yeah, it's what makes us different is, I think, amazing. And I really hope more people over time will will see that for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Cliche, is there anything else that you want to add to today, or anything you want to ask me, or anything that you want people to know from listening to you speak on all of your subjects?
I did want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
As a white passing person,
Yeah.
how do you navigate straddling those lines, if that makes sense?
In terms of like being mixed race?
Yes, absolutely.
It's really weird. I think, I very much acknowledge that I do absolutely 100% benefit from white privilege, and it's up to me to use my platforms for good and to raise up other voices, and all that kind of thing. But it's honestly really bizarre, because obviously I'm aware that I'm perceived as white, but like inside and my head, like I've grown up with like my grandmother and my mum and all of that side of the family who are they're brown skinned people, and I look quite a bit like some of those relatives, apart from how pale I am. And it's so odd to have an identity that is not obvious to behold. And as a result of that, it's really bizarre. Like I've got like a lot of my friends are white, and they'll often say things to me about, just something ordinary from their perspective. And it's just odd to me that I think that's part of white supremacy anyways, that you think that that's the default. But particularly like for me, it's like they're asking me a question expecting me to agree with them, or to even know what they're talking about, or how they see the world. And I'm like, I don't see it that way at all. So it's kind of alienating. And then I've been brought up by parents who are quite conservative in the English sense. And it's strange, like, because my dad in a lot of ways is very like old fashioned and has lots of old fashioned ideas, and he doesn't like talking about feelings too much and things like that. And yet it was him who explained to me when I was like 9 or 10 years old what racism was. And he explained to me even then the concept of white privilege, although those are not words that he used, but he said your life will be so much easier because of the color of your skin. And he comes out with things like that is so true and well ahead of his time, and at the same time, doesn't really understand like any of the trans stuff, and refers to my work as like a trend. So it's bizarre. Like I do feel that I live in such a white world that doesn't necessarily nourish me a lot of the time. Sometimes it's a drain, and not so much now because I'm more outspoken, but certainly in my teens and when I was a bit younger, people used to say there's a lot of racism in the UK aimed at Asian people, and particularly like India, Pakistan, and those types of sort of Asian people. There's a lot of racism towards like basically like my part of my family and that side of my ethnicity. So as a teenager, like I remember once I was sat with my school friends on a bench eating lunch, and this man walked past, an Asian guy. I can't remember what he was doing, but my one of my school friends, she said, oh, did you see what that Paki was wearing? And that really stung me like really hard, because you couldn't, I mean, that was the word at the time. Like people would talk a lot about Paki's this and Paki's that, and you know, they would use it to describe anyone who looked even vaguely from that part of the world. You can't tell by looking at somebody.
Sure.
And
Wow.
yeah, and they would expect me to agree, and I would have to turn around to my friends and be like, I am part Indian. And they'd be like, oh, sorry, I didn't know. And I was like, but regardless, you shouldn't be using that
Sure.
word in the first place. Like, it's fucking racist, man. And this is
Mm-hmm.
like, you know, nearly 20 years ago. So I'm in my 30s now. This was at school. And even then, like, I was very socially anxious and very socially awkward. I hadn't learned a lot of my social skills at that point. But though that was one of the instances when I really wasn't afraid of my own voice, and I would tell people off. So yeah, it's weird. I feel invisible in that sense a lot of the time, but also I don't want to be the person that talks about it so much, because I'm also aware that I have privilege. And so yeah, I do feel like my experience is possibly not as relevant to the talk on race that's happening like globally at the moment. But at the same time, yeah, I do feel invisible a lot of the time. And even within my own family and my own household, the way I think is very different. And I think there's that real sense of like shared community with people of your own kind of ethnicity, or anything like that. And like, I can occasionally get away with making a white people joke, but then I also know that I am speaking to a part of myself. I'm taking the piss out of the white part of me. And but simultaneously, I really mean it. I really mean, like, I really do view myself as, although I'm part white, I also see things from kind of like a non-white perspective. So it is really bizarre. And I put a post up not long ago actually that was saying that it's such a mixed and strange experience when you represent both a colonized person and the colonizer at the same time.
Sure.
I feel like I definitely feel like I had this mixture of both, kind of like the victim of the colonizers, and also, you know, the perpetrators themselves. Like, it's a really strange place to exist in, and not one that I feel should be given any particular priority. But at the same time, it does feel like you're floating in between demographics all the time. And yeah, I do often joke that I am just a big grey area of a lot of different things, because it's like, pick a gender, pick a sexuality, pick a race, pick, and I'm like, no, I don't exist in any of those. Just this nebulous blob. So yeah, thanks for that question. I don't I always feel like it's best for someone to invite it, otherwise you're just talking about yourself, aren't you?
Oh.
Like, because you want to.
No, thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you. No, listen, this has been really, really lovely. If people want to get a bit more of you and have more contact with you, just remind us what your Facebook page is called.
Sure, it's Not This Black Woman, and I'd love to have you there.
Cool. Yeah, go and follow her, tribe. It's really cool. And I really like how, you know, you're really boundaried in what you say. You're like, no, this is what I'm saying, and if you disagree, you need to fucking take a look at yourself. I love that about you. I often find, like, adminning my own page, I'm like, well, this is what I meant, and I think this is what the other person meant, and I try and like mediate all the time, but I want to get comfortable with having a bit of conflict like you do, because I may be a little bit of a pansy.
I think that's growth, because I totally get where you're coming from.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Not just me then. Oh dear. All right. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm sure I'll invite you back on again once you've got your teeth into your therapy. And do you ever think you'll write a book? I feel like there's a book within you. What do you think?
We'll have to see, I suppose.
Okay, maybe I'm projecting 20 years into the future. No pressure, no pressure. All right, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Transection Podcast. That was Cliche. If you want any of the links for her pages and her group and all that sort of thing, I'll include it in the show notes so you can follow those. And until next time, keep safe, wear your masks if you can. Not to make it, I know not everyone's into that, but I would encourage it personally. So yeah, anyway, keep safe and have fun, and we'll see you next time.